Welcome to the second video on probability and its application to unconditional surrender. This is Andrei Markov. Andrei Markov is not a famous Russian general. He is a famous Russian mathematician who made significant contributions to the study of probability. And as a result, when amateurs like me talk about probabilistic problems of this type, it's Markov's name that we invoke. In order to understand why we need a Markov process, I first of all need to explain a little bit about the tool that wargamers usually use for the effects of multiple dice rolls, and that's expected results. An expected result is a situation where you simply add together numbers associated with the average result that you will get on a die. So, for example, if one attack would produce a depletion to an enemy unit half the time, and another attack would produce it a quarter of a time, and another attack a quarter of the time, you add those together and you say that you're expecting one depletion on an enemy unit from that offensive. But expected results can be a misleading tool in the right circumstances. So take this example, the tank counters and the ground support. Tanks and ground support work differently in unconditional surrender. There are actually specific situations in which ground support, which is used by minor allies, is better than tanks, which are used by the major powers. A tank marker comes back on the next turn. You get to use one every turn. A ground support marker comes back 1d6 turns later. The average result of a 1d6 is 3.5, so we expect to get a ground support marker every 3.5 turns. In other words, if they were otherwise equal, a tank marker is worth about 3.5 ground support marker. At least that's the expected result. But imagine that we're working over 2 turns and that we have 6 counters available. We would get to spend 12 tank markers. We would get to spend 7 ground support. 6 are in the first turn, and then on average 1 of them would reappear on the next turn, and we'd get to spend that. And that means that a tank marker is only really worth 1.7 ground support markers. The ground support marker is twice as good as the expected results would lead us to believe. Why is that? Well, the reason is basically that there are turns in which you won't use counters. So they tend to build up in your hand, and then you tend to spend them out from there. Over an infinite time frame, tanks would indeed be 3.5 times better than ground support markers. But the game is not in fact played out over an infinite time frame. The tank is about somewhere between 1.7 and 3.5 times better than the ground support marker. And I would broadly say a tank marker is worth about 2 ground support markers in terms of its usage. It gets slightly more complicated than this in fair weather. Tank markers are worth +2, whereas ground support markers are only worth +1. But in severe weather, a tank marker isn't worth anything. A ground support marker is still worth a +1. So how do we deal with these more complicated probabilities? Well, first of all, let me illustrate how complicated even a very simple one can get. We have a panzer army, and it's attacking the Russian unit in Kursk. That's 3 movement points, so it can put in 3 attacks. The unit is surrounded and isolated, so this is a +5 versus +0 attack. A DR result will flip the unit. A DD result will destroy the unit. And what I've done above is drawn in the kind of flow chart of how those different results can result in the different endpoints. And you'll notice immediately how complicated that is. If you want to calculate this in a conventional way, you would have to trace each root, multiply together its probabilities, and then sum those probabilities that corresponded with the results that you were interested in. But I don't need to do this because I have a spreadsheet that I can just put the probabilities into and it resolves it for me. How does this spreadsheet work? Well, the type of process you just saw, this flowchart, represents a Markov process. That is, there are states that the defender can be in, full strength, depleted, destroyed. And with each attack, there's a probability of moving from one state to another. In total, there are 5 of those probabilities. And they control the relationships between all of those states. And all we want to know is, given the relationships between those states, what happens on 2 or 3, or of course for this kind of thing, potentially 4, 5, 6 attacks. This is an extract of the spreadsheet that I use for doing this, and let me just explain how this and a Markov process work. First of all, I've got the probabilities of moving from one state to another. So moving full strength to no effect, being depleted if you're at full strength, being destroyed if you're at full strength. And then, of course, if you're reduced, no effect, and being destroyed. If you're reduced, you can't be depleted again. You'll either be destroyed or nothing will happen. For each of those, I enter them into the spreadsheet as a fraction. So equals 7 over 36. We've been through this in a previous video. There are 36 possible results from any combat because both sides roll a d6. You can just look it up on the combat table and count off the number of results that correspond. So it's very easy to fill this in. 7 in 36, 16 in 36, 13 in 36, 1 in 36, and 35 in 36. Those numbers are then used in this matrix. The matrix represents the state of the unit before the attack, full strength, disrupted or destroyed, and the state of the unit after the attack, full strength, disrupted or destroyed. Now, some of those are obvious. If the unit has been destroyed, then at the end of the attack it will still be destroyed. In fact, there won't actually be an attack. Conceptually, this is an important point to get round when you're building a matrix to represent a Markov process. There's an end point that you're usually interested in, and the end point can only go to the end point. What the computer is doing is just picking up the probability that I've recorded over here, and then full strength disrupted picks up that probability, destroyed picks up that probability. Obviously, if you're disrupted, you can't go to full strength. So we only have 2 probabilities to deal with, that one and that one. So the matrix here is being filled in from these 5 results here. What I do is I keep anything that I calculate, the probabilities associated with it over on the side. So here is the +5 versus 0 situation. Now, how do I then deal with there being multiple attacks? Well, it's very simple. What I do is I use matrix multiplication. I am not going to explain to you how to do matrix multiplication. It is a long, tedious process of calculation. The point is that a spreadsheet can do it for you. So these results here, and I'll come back to how to enter this formula in a moment, but this MMult formula multiplies this array by this array. So if we want to do 2 attacks, we multiply the matrix representing 1 attack by itself. If we want to do 3 attacks, here I am in the formula, we multiply the original matrix, which represents 1 attack, by the first matrix we calculated, which represents 2 attacks. So now we have the results for 3 attacks. Then we do the same for 4 attacks, and then 5 attacks, and then 6. And we can carry on doing that. The only awkward thing in a spreadsheet to be aware of is that when you put in an MMult formula, you at least I think this is different in different versions of Excel, but in the version I use, you need to highlight the area in question, type the formula in, and then press Control-Shift-Enter to tell the computer that it's a formula that covers an area, because you're multiplying a matrix, which is multiple cells, by another matrix, which is multiple cells. And so we can see in my spreadsheet here that by the time we get to 3 attacks, across the top row, which represents that the unit was at full strength to begin with, and then down the 3rd column, and we see that there's a 97% chance of destroying the defending unit in this situation. We can see that the unit was already disrupted. The chance of destroying it is so close to 100% that the 2 decimal places I'm leaving can't actually tell the difference. This basic tool is central to understanding certain types of probabilities. This is essentially anything where there is a chain of similar actions and you are interested in the end result rather than the initial result. And the area in which that's most obviously applicable in unconditional surrender is strategic warfare. Okay, so we're going to apply this to strategic warfare in the game. The movement of any one country's factory lost counter is a classic Markov process, and we'll run through some common situations. But first, I need to revisit the strategic warfare rules. This is the combat results table, labelled up as it is affected by strategic warfare. Once the Axis are at war with a faction, they conduct a strategic warfare attack each round at the beginning of the round. First against the Soviets, and then against the Western powers. There are 3 possible results. If they get a no effect, then both sides reduce their factory lost markers. If a DR, DD or DE result, then the Western or the Soviet power increases their factory lost by 1 and the Axis faction reduces. If an AS or AA result, then Germany increases its factory lost and the Allied faction reduces their factory lost. That's pretty simple. And it has one immediate and obvious effect. You very rarely get a situation where both an Allied faction and the Axis have high factory lost. It operates like a seesaw. When one side goes down, the other side goes up, or vice versa. There are a bunch of modifiers. They come in 3 basic groups. There are the various DRM modifiers for holding particular positions on the board. Come back to those in a moment. There are a set of counters, which include submarines, partisans, ultra, that halve the opponent's dice roll. And there are the bombers, which become available in 1942 to the Allied players to allow them to conduct strategic bombing. A quick note here on the various strategic combat DRMs. They're listed on the player aid in a slightly unhelpful way with the C-zone number. What they in practice mean is that the Axis get a bonus for stationing a unit in Brest. They get a bonus for stationing an air unit in Norway. They get bonuses against the Soviets for holding Murmansk, which is very unusual. They get bonuses against everybody for holding Iraq, and for winning in the Middle East and getting Suez, they get a bonus against the West. The Allies get a bonus for stationing a fleet or air unit in the Baltic. So that's essentially Copenhagen, Sweden, or capturing Königsberg for the Soviets. So let's look at some actual practical examples, and we'll begin with one of those. Is Norway worth the effort? So if you're playing the historical scenario, you will find the following setup in Norway. There will be a Luftwaffe unit at Stavanger. There will be a convoy to supply it at Oslo, and an infantry unit available to act as a garrison. The infantry unit is usually placed at Oslo. That's a terrible place for the infantry unit to be. It does allow it to respond to invasions at Bergen or Stavanger, but the Allies only really need to regain control of those ports. They don't actually need to reconquer Norway to stop the strategic DRM from applying. Now the question is it worth all of the effort of capturing Norway, which means either bringing Sweden on side or conquering Sweden, or spending your surprise attack marker and then stationing these units there to get the bonuses? The combat table here shows the odds for the Germans holding both Brest and Norway after the USA has entered the war. And the yellow indicates the shift if the Germans do not hold Norway. This indicates the same mid-war position against the Soviets. The yellow shift shows both not holding Norway, but also not conquering 7 countries. So historically, it's usually 8. But of course, if you don't take Norway, it's possible to only conquer 6 countries. And then there's a possibility of fighting with only a +2 Soviet modifier. Here are how the odds pan out. So we have the chances of the Russians getting an AS or AA, and the chances of the UK getting an AS or AA, and those interact to produce +2, -2, or 0. So that's the very first thing to note. Once you are fighting both opponents, the movement is quite crude. There is never a 1-point shift up or down in the strategic warfare. There are only 3 possible results. Either it jumps 2, or it drops 2, or it stays the same, at least when you're viewing it purely from the German perspective. There are 2 special cases. At 1 factory lost, obviously it won't go any lower. That's the rule. You can't go below 1 factory lost. It might go up by 1 or up by 2. Now you'll notice here that the thing that really matters is the UK's result, not the Russian result. That's worth bearing in mind. We'll come back to it later. And the same thing at 9 factories lost. It can go down by 1 or it can go down by 2. But it's the Western faction, the UK, that basically determines whether or not you hold the Germans at 9 factories lost. The Russian contribution only matters if the UK fails. So I plug all the data into a spreadsheet that's set up for a Markov process. This is like the one I showed you earlier, but you can see now that it's a 9x9 matrix and that it has 9 different probabilities. That's the chances of pushing up by 2, falling by 2, or staying at 0 if you are in a 2 to 8 range, and then the special cases when we're at 1 factory lost and 9 factory lost. The same thing, I've recorded different probabilities that I'm using on the right hand side, so I can substitute any of those in at any time to look to see what the results are, and I've got the thing laid out to tell me the results for 12 months in advance. Now I've got the 2 different scenarios. So this is with Norway and at least 7 countries conquered versus not having conquered Norway and only 6 countries conquered. And you can see immediately that there's quite a dramatic difference. If you've taken Norway, the German factory lost marker will stay at 1 factory lost. And it will gravitate to 1 factory lost if for some reason it isn't already at 1 factory lost. And if you haven't done that, then things are quite evenly balanced, and the odds are that the factory lost will simply stay wherever it is. Now, obviously, that does mean that if it's at 1 factory lost already, it's going to largely stay around 1 factory lost. But you can see that, broadly speaking, right, there is a difference between the first of these being a good position for Germany and the second of these being a very balanced, precarious position for Germany. The other thing you will notice about these tables is it makes very little difference if you run the data out to 12 months than if you run it out to 6 months. Now, that's an important general lesson to learn about strategic warfare. The way it feels, the play experience, is that it's this long, slow game that gradually shifts the economies of what's happening in the war. But it's not. It's not at all. It tends to gravitate around a particular result, and it tends to do it very quickly because, of course, once you're facing 2 opponents, you shift 2 factory lost markers, 2 factory lost spaces at a time. And the result is that a shift in strategic warfare has its impact at about the same speed that a summer offensive does. It's basically a 3 or 4 month thing, and then you're in a new status quo. It isn't a long, slow game at all. So that's worth bearing in mind. If in 1943 you really need to use partisan markers for their combat bonuses, that's not going to make any difference to what your strategic warfare position is in late 1944. Keep that point in mind, and we'll look at a different scenario. This is an Allied one. Is Copenhagen worth the effort? So these are always the questions that you have to ask with everything to do with strategic warfare. I have to expend resources I could use elsewhere in order to engage in the strategic warfare. Is it worth the effort to do so? This situation arises quite a bit. If the German army invades Denmark, and it doesn't do it with at least 2 units in fair weather, then the odds are it will capture Aalborg, taking Denmark out of the war, but not quite get to Copenhagen. Now, most of the time, that doesn't really matter. You can just capture the other city on the next turn. However, it allows the Allied player to immediately sail the British Expeditionary Force into Copenhagen, then use a strategic move on the next turn to place that unit defending the straits if the Axis do not interfere with a strategic move of their own. This places a fleet in Sea Zone 13. So this is not about holding Copenhagen. The British Expeditionary Force is not the objective. The objective is the fleet. The British Expeditionary Force is there to protect the fleet. And the Allies will get a +2 in the strategic warfare phase if they have a fleet in Copenhagen. Here are the odds during the Battle of France, with just the UK fighting the strategic warfare. You can see this is quite good. The odds work differently when there's only one nation involved. Every turn, either Germany's factory loss marker will go up by 1 or it will go down by 1. And you can see the odds swing significantly in the UK's favour with a Copenhagen fleet. How does this look once we plug it in 4 months in advance into the Markov matrices? Well, it doesn't have as much effect as you might expect. And this is partly because the marker will only shift 1 point a turn. So you can see that it will mean that the Germans are generally running 2 to 4 factory lost. Without it, they'd be running at 1 factory lost. Now, it's very important to remember the Germans get a +2 when they take Brest, i.e. when they conquer France. So this is not a long-lived bonus. However, let's reverse that. This is now the data 12 months out for the British. So this is asking, what did the British look like in 1941 if they stationed a fleet in Copenhagen and held it there as long as possible? Now, I've held a fleet in Copenhagen until July 1941. I don't think that the British can guarantee that, but the Germans do have to expend significant resources to move the fleet in poor weather. And you can see the effect immediately. The British will have a significant factory lost if they do not station the fleet. However, this is not a representative example of how things work. In the actual game, the Germans will conquer France, and once they do, they will hold Brest, which means that they will have these odds because they will match the Copenhagen fleet. If the Copenhagen fleet is not there, then the Germans will be at a significant advantage. With the Copenhagen fleet in place, the British factory lost marker will generally be on 1. Without the Copenhagen fleet in place, it's going to be running somewhere in the 2 to 5 range. That's a big difference for the British. Why does this matter? Well, it's fundamentally about Africa. So this is an example of how the game is interconnected. The question of whether or not you station a fleet in Copenhagen and whether or not you expend the resources to do that is a question that is answered by looking at the North Africa campaign. Africa is always a supply contest. The Italian player has 4 basic supply routes. The safest of these is usually Tripoli back to Sicily. More difficult are Benghazi and Tobruk back to Italy. But it's worth noting Tobruk can also run to the Balkans if there's somewhere under direct German control that then creates a path back to Italy. The Allied player has 3 major interception points that are available to them. There's Malta, which can intercept the 3 westernmost of these routes. There's Alexandria, which can intercept the 3 easternmost of these. And hugely important, there's Carnia in Crete, which can intercept all 4 of them. Here are the odds for a British carrier in fair weather intercepting an Italian ship that has 4 sorties. And you will notice that it's a certainty. Essentially, if a British carrier catches an Italian fleet escorting a convoy and both are close to exhaustion, they will be intercepted and turned back. Of course, the British have to get the Italians to that stage, but they can do so. Now, let's have a think about this. To run a complete interception, the British player needs a carrier. They need a fleet. Because remember, they have to intercept twice. They have to intercept 2 separate convoys. They will usually need a fighter to protect the carrier or the fleet if it's based at Malta or if it's based on Crete, because those are within range of land-based Axis fighter elements. And they will also need convoys, both convoys to run their own troops down in Egypt, a convoy at Suez, but also a convoy to run that fighter that is screening for the carrier or the fleet. That's 18 points. Let's look at the budget for that. We have 18 production points needed to run the basic Mediterranean budget. The UK has 7 mainland factories in the UK itself. That's 14 production points. It has 2 overseas factories in Cairo and Jerusalem. This, by the way, is why a loss in Africa and the Middle East is so devastating to the British. It doesn't just give a strategic warfare penalty, it takes away 2 of the British factories, which is 4 production points every turn. They also have the UK Lend-Lease, which increases their factory count by 1 every 6 months. And they have the one-off boost that comes from Commonwealth trade, which increases their factory count by 3. Now remember, the moment that West Invaded happens, not only do those 2 events, Lend-Lease and Commonwealth trade, trigger, But strategic warfare immediately starts, and the British always have one factory lost marker in the game. So let's look at this within the historical scenario of the UK's Mediterranean budget. You will see that at the beginning of the game, they are producing the 18 production points that they would in theory need to keep the Italians from running convoys, though it's not generally enough to both fight on the land and shut down the Italian convoys. But they drop into a hungry gap for 6 months after West Invaded is triggered, where they only have 16 points before the Commonwealth trade kicks in. And then from there, over the course of the war, the Lend-Lease gradually ramps up their production capacity until they've got far more production points than they actually need to run all of their units. And that's where strategic warfare matters. 2 or 3 additional points of strategic warfare will not only cripple the British during that critical 6 months before the Commonwealth trade arrives, it may well push them down into an area where they're 12 months before they can generate enough production points to run their Mediterranean operation. So that fleet up in Copenhagen makes a huge difference to the action in the Mediterranean. And therefore, it's broadly speaking worth doing. Finally, I want to look at the late war strategic warfare. This is what the table looks like once the USA is in the war and Germany is taking 6 bombing markers a turn. You can see that it does not matter what anybody rolls. The Germans are suffering a factory loss from this result. Even if the Germans apply a submarine marker, they're still very likely to receive an AS result, and they certainly won't get to a DR result. On the Eastern Front, in the historical scenario with 7 to 9 conquered countries, it looks like this, assuming that you haven't taken Norway, which again is a question around whether or not Norway is worth the effort for this. And it creates a chart that looks like this, and we plug that into a Markov process, and it looks like this 5 months in. There's some important lessons to take from this. The Axis player is going to lose. This is a losing proposition. The Soviet strategic warfare, not the Western warfare, is what actually matters. So feel free to use your Western partisans and your ultra tactically. The resource that you are actually having to worry about is the Soviet partisans. If you use the Soviet partisans, they will accelerate the German strategic warfare defeat. If you don't, then they may well slow it down. By the way, if you're playing this and you're thinking about it from the other point of view, this also means that usually you're better off spending the submarines fighting the Soviets than you are using them to counter the Allies. Unless, and this happens quite a lot, the Allies accidentally forget to do their bombing runs on a turn. But let's look at a hypothetical. Can the Luftwaffe stop the daylight bombing? So, for those people who don't know, when the United States entered the war, it began a daylight bombing campaign against Germany. The idea was that in daylight you would be able to precision bomb factories. Now, of course, they couldn't actually do this because they'd radically overestimated how accurate they could be, but it did mean that there was a very heavy, sustained bombing campaign against German factories throughout the later part of the war. One, that the Axis High Command, because it was rather childishly obsessed with battlefield victories, did not really tackle. But you could. Here is the best spot for German air defence. 3 spaces east of Frankfurt. In this position, a German Luftwaffe unit can cover all of the German cities, except for those in the east, Posen and Königsberg. And any Allied bomber will have to navigate 2 hexas to get through to the western cities at Dusseldorf, Aachen and Metz, which allows 2 intercept attempts. Here's what the odds look like of a German fighter intercepting a UK or US bomber. You can see immediately these are great odds. About 2 in 3 of stopping the attack. The problem is the number of sorties that you have to spend. A single fighter can't keep up with 3 bombers. It will rapidly find itself overwhelmed. It will be spending more than 2 sorties a turn, and the moment it gets up to a decent number of sorties, that's it, it's game over. It won't be able to intercept effectively any longer. So you need 2 fighters. They need to be kept at full strength, which means they intercept. If they end up with 2 sorties, they stop intercepting. You don't intercept with a fighter that's already got 2 sorties, and at the end of the turn you spend 6 production points to bring those fighters back down to fresh status in order to be able to do it again. In terms of positioning the second fighter, it depends to some extent on where the Allies are attacking from. You might wish to position it further east if the Allies have bomber units in Italy attempting to go round you and hit Posen or Danzig or Posen or Königsberg. Same goes obviously for Sweden. Otherwise, position 1 just adjacent to the fighter 3 hexes east of Frankfurt, and it can basically do the same job. Here's what the tables look like if you stop the bombing versus if you don't. The critical thing to realise is that stopping the bombers will at best stabilise the situation. You would need some other bonus, either having conquered fewer countries or still occupying Norway, in order to actually reverse the effects of strategic warfare. Which means that if you're planning to do this, if Luftwaffe air defence is something you wish to engage in, it needs to be in place in 1942. You need the first German fighter stopping the initial British bombers in 1942. And it needs to be reinforced in 1943 to meet the American bombing campaign beginning then. Which means keeping those 2 Luftwaffe units away from either front and engaged in German activity pretty much the whole of the war. Last thing, and I'm not going to cover this in detail, is using the markers. All of the markers halve the opponent's roll. So this is what happens when you spend a submarine marker against the Soviets. It reduces what is a losing Axis roll to an even roll. Now, an even roll, of course, in practice is really, really good because it means a 2 in 3 chance of the Axis factory loss marker going down. Now, here's the alternative use for a submarine marker, which would be to attempt to intercept an Allied fleet. And this is the trade-off you're always making. Use the marker for its tactical effect, or use it for its strategic warfare effect. The odds of a successful German interception of an Allied fleet are very, very low. Not just low, but very low. Less than 1 in 20 is the chances of successfully interdicting a British convoy. At least a British convoy that's escorted, and I can't really imagine any reason from the mid-war onwards why a British convoy would not be escorted. But throw in 2 sub-markers, 1 to engage the fleet and then 1 to engage the convoy, and it goes up to actually a reasonable odds, a little less than 1 in 4. A successful interdiction is pretty useful. It takes 2 sorties off the fleet, 2 sorties off the convoy, and then the British have to run that again. So in order to do their supply run, they use 3 sorties instead of 1 sortie, which means that they effectively then spend 6 production points replacing the sorties that your interception cost. At a critical moment, it can really matter. The question is, are those 6 production points that you will pull together every 4 or 5 turns because you successfully interdicted a fleet worth not spending the sub-marker to slow down the effect of Allied strategic warfare? And unfortunately, like a lot of things, that understanding the Markov processes won't actually answer, because there's a whole bunch of tactical and strategic trade-offs that are being made, and you've got to evaluate those. What the Markov tools give you is a way of quantifying what one of those decisions will make, to match against the fact that you can already do the basic DRM probabilities to quantify what the effect of spending the sub-markers on interdiction will be. Broadly speaking, if you care about my opinion, I feel that spending the sub-markers to do interdictions of convoys is, broadly speaking, not worth the effort. That the surface markers should essentially be saved only to be used against unescorted convoys if one of them comes past, and that if you are going to save the subs, the threat of them should be to engage a landing force, an amphibious invasion force, or to be used with the Italians, who have significantly more naval assets. And that otherwise you should broadly be using sub-markers in the early war to hurt the British. Once you get into both sides, into the US being in the war, they should be used against the Soviets to try and slow down the strategic warfare drain as much as possible. So, here are some general tips. Don't waste Soviet counters on German 1 or 9 factory lost turns. Remember, the Soviets run their strategic warfare first, and as we've seen, when you're at 1 or 9 German factory lost markers, it's the Allies that matters. Counters won't substitute for or stop a substantial dice roll modifier advantage. They are not enough on their own to turn around having a 3-point disadvantage on the dice rolls. Focus your use. All subs on one ally if you're the Germans, or coordinate the Soviet and Western counters if you're playing the Allies. Do not play things piecemeal. Coordinated use is the key to these being effective. And so here endeth the lesson. I've covered a lot of different aspects of strategic warfare. There's actually quite a lot of detail in the strategic warfare system. Generally speaking on these, what I'm going to do is follow this same format. If I have something to say about the gameplay experience and the rules that's kind of reviewish in nature, I will save it to this moment at the end of the actual analysis. And I do kind of have something to say on this particular one. The strategic warfare feels like a slow grind where your decisions in 1942 really make a difference to the end game position. But that's an illusion. It's a matter of player experience, not reality. In reality, strategic warfare decisions are pretty much played out within 3 to 4 months of making them. And I think that that's actually bad, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of historical accuracy. I think that the decisions that mattered in 1944 or 1945 were made in 1942 or 1943. They weren't made in 1944, which is how the game treats it. The decision that matters for German factory losses over the winter rebuilding endgame are made in the summer offensive in 1944. And I feel they ought to be made in 1942. I think that's doable. I think it's perfectly possible to change the strategic warfare system to do that. And because it kind of feels like that, I feel like it's the way the game is supposed to work. And it's to some extent just a lack of analytics on the game that mean that the game's design doesn't line up with its intent. But your mileage on that may vary. So enjoy your plays, and I will see you for the next one.